30 myths are waiting for you. 30 times you will feel that unique sting, a mix of amazement, slight embarrassment, and excitement. Amazement at how far from the truth we were. Embarrassment for believing it for so long. Excitement because the real truth is much more interesting. If you're ready to uncover the truths behind the myths that have been believed for centuries, support this series with a like and share in the comments. Which revelation shocked you the most? Your feedback will inspire us to explore new archives. So, the first door is now open. Come in. Myth number 1. The naked genius in the bath, or how beautiful legends are born. Picture this scene. It stands before you in all its vivid, undeniable glory. Syracuse, around 212 BC. An old man with a wild gray beard emerges into a filled bathtub. Water splashes over the edge. Suddenly, an epiphany strikes. He leaps up, wet and naked, filled with the ecstasy of discovery, racing through the streets, shouting to the entire city one word, "Eureka! I found it!" Neighbors scatter in horror, children laugh, and the great Archimedes notices nothing. He has grasped one of the fundamental laws of physics. This image is engraved in humanity's cultural memory. It's reproduced in textbooks, featured in documentaries, and retold in physics classes around the world. Archimedes in the bath is the essence of genius, the image of sudden insight, a symbol of science. For centuries, this tale has served as proof that great discoveries do not come in the silence of laboratories, but in moments of serendipitous occurrence. But here's the question that almost no one asks. Who actually saw this? The story of Archimedes, the bath, and the cry of Eureka comes from a single source, a treatise by the Roman architect Vitruvius, written about 200 years after Archimedes' death. 200 years of oral tradition, retellings, inevitable embellishments, and simplifications. Vitruvius was neither a mathematician nor a scientist. He mentioned the story in passing within a treatise on architecture to illustrate a problem supposedly posed to Archimedes by King Hiero II, to determine whether a jeweler had mixed silver into a golden crown. It's worth noting that this problem was entirely real and indeed difficult. The crown weighed exactly what it was supposed to, yet the king remained suspicious. And here's where the most interesting revelation begins. The principle of Archimedes, as described by Vitruvius, the displacement of water, actually does not work to solve the crown problem, mathematically, at all. Consider this. The volume difference between a pure gold crown and one diluted with silver at the same weight would be minuscule. We're talking fractions of a cubic centimeter. The measuring devices of antiquity lacked the precision to detect such a small difference in displaced water volume. This isn't speculation. It's a basic calculation carried out by modern physicists trying to replicate the experiment. The method doesn't work, at least not in that simplistic form of a bath overflowing with water. So how might Archimedes have actually solved the problem? Among researchers, there are several theories, and one of the most convincing belongs to Galileo. In 1586, Galileo wrote a short treatise called La Bilancetta, which translates to The Little Balances. In this work, he suggested that Archimedes used hydrostatic scales, weighing an object first in air and then in water to determine its specific weight. This method is far more precise and aligns better with the mathematical rigor characteristic of Archimedes' work. There's also another delicate point. Archimedes himself never mentions a bathtub or the famous cry of Eureka. His own writings that have survived, on floating bodies, on the measurement of the circle, and the method, are composed in a dry, strict mathematical language. Archimedes was evidently a person obsessed with proofs and logical reasoning. The very idea that he would run out into the street naked, abandoning a line of thought, contradicts everything we know about his character and work method. But why, then, has this story endured, blossomed, and become canonical? Because it fulfills a deep human need. We love to think of genius as a flash of insight, a bolt of lightning, a singular moment. We don't like to contemplate that genius often comes from years of grueling labor, piles of written papyrus, and hundreds of discarded hypotheses. The story of the bathtub is beautiful and democratic. It suggests that an epiphany could happen to anyone, even in their own bathroom. In contrast, the tale of years of systematic effort is far less inspiring. The word eureka, however, could very well have belonged to Archimedes, just not necessarily shouted while naked in the street. Moreover, eureka is the first-person singular perfect tense form of the Greek verb heuriskine, which means to find. This is a perfectly ordinary Greek word that anyone might utter upon discovering something. Finding keys, discovering the answer to a problem, or locating a lost child. The real Archimedes is a far more majestic and enigmatic figure than a cheerful old man in a bathtub. He was the person who, armed only with a reed pen and papyrus, developed methods of integral calculus 18 centuries before Newton and Leibniz. He was the engineer whose inventions, catapults, cranes, possibly a system of mirrors for igniting ships, kept Roman legions at bay during nearly 3 years of the siege of Syracuse. He was the mathematician who remarkably calculated the value of pi with astonishing precision using the method of inscribed and circumscribed polygons, leaving this accuracy unchallenged for centuries. When, in 212 BC, a Roman soldier ultimately killed him, defying a direct order from Marcellus to bring the scholar back alive, Archimedes was reportedly engrossed in geometric diagrams drawn in the sand. "Do not disturb my circles," were his last words as recounted by various sources. This story, too, is probably apocryphal, yet it conveys the essence of the man far more accurately than the tales of bathtubs and street cries. Archimedes deserves to be remembered not as a lucky man who happened to have leaves fall into his bath, but as one of the greatest minds ever to walk the earth, working methodically, rigorously, and tirelessly. Unfortunately, this story is less marketable. As we say goodbye to the image of the wet genius running through the streets, we encounter the next myth, about people often regarded as dirty and ignorant. The myth of the Middle Ages, born not from the ignorance of those it depicts, but from the arrogance of those who created it. Myth number 2, the dirty Middle Ages, or how the Enlightenment slandered the past. In modern language, the term medieval has become synonymous with backwardness, savagery, and filth. We use expressions like medieval methods, medieval thinking, and medieval sanitation to refer to things that are simply unacceptable in the 21st century. At the core of this usage lies a specific image: dark streets in European cities, littered with filth, dirty, unwashed people in rags who sincerely believed that washing was a sin because it exposed their naked bodies to the devil, and that water washed away the sacred oil of baptism from their skin. So where did this image come from? From the works of Renaissance thinkers, and especially those of the Enlightenment, individuals who built their identity by opposing themselves to the Dark Ages. It was convenient for them to portray the previous era as a pit of ignorance from which they rescued humanity. They did this with great pleasure and literary flair. The result was so convincing that it persists in the collective consciousness to this day. There's just one problem. It's not true. Let's start with the basics, the sources. If we open medieval medical treatises, of which many have survived, we will find regular prescriptions for bathing. The famous Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, written in the 11th century and serving as a primary medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century, details personal hygiene rules, how often to bathe, the appropriate water temperature, and how washing impacts health. Medieval monastic rules, such as the Rule of St. Benedict and its many derivatives, contain specific instructions regarding washing hands before meals and regular bathing. Medieval cities had public baths, not just shabby puddles, real baths complete with hot water, scrubbers, and staff. In 13th century Paris, historical documents indicate there were over 26 public baths. In London, establishments called stews offered hot baths. In many German cities, baths operated several times a week, and visiting them was a normal part of urban life, much like going to a cafe today. Wealthy individuals, of course, had baths in their homes. There are detailed accounts of bathing rituals in castles, including the types of additives for the water: rose water, aromatic herbs, flower petals. Expensive aromatic oils for bathing were a matter of trade and are mentioned in the inventories of wealthy households. Body rubbing gloves, the medieval equivalent of sponges, were sold in markets. Now let's discuss theology. Was there a belief in the Middle Ages that bathing was a sin? Yes, some theologians expressed caution regarding lavish baths, but their reasons were far from hygiene. Baths served as places for social mingling, where men and women sometimes found themselves in dangerously close quarters, where prostitution thrived, and where people relaxed and enjoyed themselves. The Church's critique of baths was a criticism of debauchery, not of cleanliness. The Church Fathers, advocating for asceticism, sometimes dramatically rejected bathing as a bodily pleasure, but this was an ascetic practice of a minority, not the norm. So, what led to a genuine decline in hygiene during certain periods? It was not theology, but epidemics. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, medical practitioners of the time began to fear that open pores from hot baths made people vulnerable to miasmas, toxic vapors that contemporary medicine believed caused illness. This was a mistaken theory, but it was medical rather than religious. After these epidemics, the frequency of bathing did decrease, and this decline lasted roughly from the 14th to the 17th century. This period became the source of later descriptions of filthy Europe. However, this doesn't represent the entire medieval age. It describes a specific historical period driven by specific fears. There's another aspect that completely dismantles the caricature. Medieval washing practices were quite advanced. Clothes were washed, bleached, and aired out. Undergarments, shirts and petticoats, were regularly laundered precisely because they came into contact with the body. Odors from clothing were socially unacceptable in medieval society, just as they are today. Historical records show that lack of cleanliness resulted in public condemnation. So where does the persistent odor of this myth come from? Partly from the confusion between poverty and dirtiness. Poor people in any era have always been less clean than the wealthy, not due to beliefs, but because of a lack of resources. A peasant living in one room with livestock was certainly not a model of hygiene, but neither was an urban poor person in the slums of 19th century London or 20th century New York. This isn't a medieval specificity. It is a specificity of poverty. And there's also literature to consider. Biographies of ascetic saints who intentionally renounced comfort were perceived by later readers as descriptions of the norm. Saint Simeon the Stylite went for years without washing. This is a depiction of a feat, not a standard. The real medieval era was more complex, contradictory, and cleaner than its reputation suggests. This revelation is important, not because we need to, quote, rehabilitate the past, but because it reminds us that every era tends to portray the previous one as dark to appear brighter itself. This is not historical methodology, it's propaganda. By the way, the next myth is also about reputation, but it concerns war, not an era. It's about how convenient explanations for defeat rewrite history to favor those who cannot face the truth. Soldiers, or who really lost Vietnam. There are stories that a nation tells itself to cope with defeat, not because they are true, but because they are psychologically necessary. The narrative of a war betrayed from the rear is one such tale, and it remains so enduring that it is still echoed in lectures, films, and political speeches. The image is simple and tempting. The American soldier, brave, professional, undefeated on the battlefield. The Viet Cong suffer losses at a ratio of 10 to 1, or even more. But back home, in university lecture halls and on television screens, the anti-war movement is said to be destroying morale. Journalists relayed demoralizing reports, and politicians, pressured by the public, cut funding and forced the military to abandon the effort halfway. Soldiers, who lost not a single battle, lost the war, due to betrayal from the rear. This concept is known as the stab-in-the-back myth, resembling the German legend of Dolchstoßlegende after World War I, and it is as historically unfounded. Let's examine the facts, not images, but numbers and documents. American forces did indeed win the majority of tactical engagements. This is true. However, the military strategy of North Vietnam did not initially aim for victory in tactical encounters. It aimed for victory over time. General Vo Nguyen Giap and his strategists understood perfectly well that they could not destroy the American army in open combat. Their goal was different: to inflict enough losses that American society would grow weary of the war and demand its end. This is no secret. It's a documented strategy that Jop publicly articulated. In other words, the anti-war movement was not the cause of American defeat, but rather a target of the enemy's strategy. And this fundamentally alters the assessment of the situation. American society acted precisely as Hanoi had anticipated, not because it was weak or traitorous, but because democracy responds to human losses, while the communist government of North Vietnam could ignore its own losses at a cost that a democratic state could not bear. Now, let's address the military failures that are conveniently overlooked in the betrayal from the rear narrative. The body count strategy, measuring success by the number of enemy killed, created monstrous incentives to falsify reports. Unit commanders felt pressured to inflate enemy casualties for their careers. Reports were sent up the chain, embellished again, and the Pentagon received a picture of a victorious war that bore no resemblance to reality. This issue is extensively documented, including internal investigations by the U.S. Army. The pacification program, an attempt to control the rural population of South Vietnam, failed not because of the protests in Berkeley, but due to fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of war. American strategists brought models from World War II and Korea, wars between states with clearly defined front lines, only to find a completely different conflict where the front was everywhere and nowhere, and the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian. The Vietnamese New Year offensive of 1968, Tet, was a turning point, not because the American army was defeated. Militarily, the Viet Cong's offensive was repelled, with heavy losses for the attackers. However, it shattered the main narrative that the Johnson administration sold to the American people, that the war was nearing a victorious end, that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. If the enemy was able to simultaneously attack over 100 locations across South Vietnam, then the narrative was a lie. And the American public understood this. Not because journalists, quote, betrayed them, but because the facts became undeniable. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which the Nixon administration presented as an honorable peace, were essentially a capitulation with a delay. The terms that the United States accepted were categorically unacceptable in '69, but quite acceptable in '73. North Vietnamese troops remained in the south of the country. This was not a victory, it was a managed retreat. The anti-war movement undoubtedly influenced policy, but it was a symptom, not the cause. The true cause was that the war was indeed going poorly, and American families receiving death notices had the right to know. The legend of betrayal at home is convenient because it shifts the responsibility away from military and political leadership and places it on people who were simply reacting to the loss of their children. This is a morally inverted narrative, and that's why it's so appealing to those who made the decisions. However, myths about the right cause arose long before Vietnam. The next myth, about the most celebrated military campaign of Christianity, will show us how a noble legend conceals a much more mundane reality. Myth number 4. God wills it, or what really drove the Crusaders. Deus vult. God wills it. This cry resounded through the crowd in Claremont in November of 1995, when Pope Urban II delivered a speech that changed history. Thousands of people, according to chroniclers, immediately began sewing crosses of red fabric onto their shoulders, symbols of pilgrimage and a military vow. Thus began what we call the First Crusade. The official version, repeated by historians, theologians, and popularizers for 9 centuries, goes like this. Western Christians, shocked by reports that Muslim conquerors, the Seljuks, were desecrating holy sites and oppressing pilgrims, rose up for a holy war to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. This was a movement of faith, selfless, sacrificial, driven by sincere religious fervor. This is partly true, and that's why it's so difficult to uncover the truth. Let's start with what happened before the speech in Claremont. Just a few months prior, Urban II received a letter from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos. The letter contained a request for military assistance against the Seljuks, who had reclaimed much of Asia Minor from Byzantium over the past decades. This was not a religious call. It was a political plea from an ally in a difficult situation. Urban II was a brilliant politician. He understood perfectly that he had the opportunity to solve several pressing issues with one move. First and foremost, the knighthood of Western Europe had long posed a serious threat to social order. Landless younger sons of noble families, lacking peaceful pursuits, engaged in robbery, banditry, and endless private wars that plagued the civilian population and the church itself. Channeling their aggression outward against the infidels would be an excellent solution to this problem. Secondly, the crusade offered a chance to significantly boost the authority of the papacy, which was in sharp conflict with the German emperors at that time. Whoever leads a war for all Christendom automatically rises above any secular ruler. Now, let's talk about the persecution of Christians in Jerusalem. The Seljuks captured the city in 71, 24 years before Claremont. Over those 24 years, pilgrimage to Jerusalem never stopped. Christian pilgrims continued to arrive in the Holy City, paying tolls and praying at the Holy Sepulchre. There was no systematic persecution of Christians documented. This is confirmed by sources, including the Crusaders themselves, who found thriving Christian communities upon their arrival in Jerusalem. Urban's speech in Claremont was preserved in several versions, all written after the campaign had been successful. Chroniclers describing it attributed words to the Pope that already knew of victory. We don't know for certain what he said in November of 95. The composition of the participants in the campaign is also noteworthy. Alongside sincerely devout knights who took vows of poverty for the duration of the campaign were individuals with very specific earthly interests. Norman adventurers from southern Italy, Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, saw the campaign as an opportunity to create their own states in the east. This is exactly what happened. Bohemond became the Prince of Antioch without returning it to Alexios, to whom it rightfully belonged. Raymond of Toulouse aspired to become the King of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon sold or mortgaged nearly all of his possessions before embarking on the campaign, which speaks not of selflessness, but of a man betting on future conquests. And finally, what happened during the capture of Jerusalem in 99? Chronicles, including those written by Crusaders, described the indiscriminate massacre of a city's population, regardless of their religion. Muslims were not the only ones killed. Jews were also targeted, forced into synagogues where they were burned alive, and Eastern Christians were often mistaken for, quote, enemies. These same chronicles depict warriors standing in blood up to their ankles, praising the Lord. They were people deeply convinced of the righteousness of their cause, and it is this conviction that makes their actions particularly striking. The First Crusade was both a religious movement and a political project, as well as a conquest venture all at once. To attribute it solely to one of these dimensions would be misleading. The truth is that people rarely act for a single reason, and history that simplifies complexity tends to hide something important. From holy wars to a cup of tea. The next myth is also about origins, but it is much more peaceful and far more elegantly constructed. Myth number 5, the random beverage of the gods, or how a legend about discovery is created. 3,000 years before Christ. The wise Chinese Emperor Shen Nong sits in his garden under a tree while a servant boils water for him. For even then, in China, it was known that raw water can be dangerous. A gentle breeze sweeps through the garden, dislodging a few leaves from the nearest branch, which falls right into the boiling vessel. The water changes color, turning a soft amber. A curious court scholar takes a sip. Aroma, flavor, invigoration, clarity of thought. Thus, according to one of the most popular versions, tea was discovered. This story is delightful. It features chance, a wise observer, and a majestic setting. It perfectly fits the genre of the discovery myth, the same genre that includes Archimedes in his bath and Newton with his apple. Chance plus a willing mind, and something arises that changes the world. The historical value of this narrative is close to zero. To start with, Shen Nong is a mythological figure. He is not a historical personage for whom we have documentary evidence. He is the legendary divine farmer, credited in Chinese tradition with the discovery of agriculture, medicine, various plants, and, yes, tea. Functionally, he resembles Prometheus or Romulus, a cultural hero to whom society attributes achievements that actually developed gradually over millennia through the efforts of countless unnamed individuals. The legend of Shen Nong and tea first appears in written sources not in ancient times but relatively late, during the Tang Dynasty around the 8th century AD. This is about the same time tea began its transformation from a medicinal herb and regional beverage into a national cultural phenomenon. In other words, the story of the discovery was crafted at a time when there was already a desire for a beautiful narrative about the origin of a beloved drink. So, what does the real history tell us? It is far less romantic, but much more interesting. Tea as a plant, scientifically known as Camellia sinensis, originates from the mountainous regions at the intersection of what are now the Chinese province of Yunnan, Myanmar, and India. This is an area where the plant has grown wild for thousands of years. The local peoples, particularly the ethnic groups of Yunnan, consumed the tea leaves long before it became a quote-unquote Chinese tradition. They chewed them, brewed them into soups with salt and fat, and used them for medicinal purposes. The earliest reliable historical mentions of tea date back to the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. This is not 3000 BC, but rather 5,000 years later than the legend suggests. Early documents primarily describe tea as a medicine. It was consumed for headaches, fatigue, and to aid digestion. It was only later that it became a beverage for enjoyment. A significant cultural shift, the transformation of tea into a philosophical and aesthetic phenomenon, occurred during the Tang Dynasty, the 6th to 10th centuries AD. Around this time, the canonical text Tea Classic by Lu Yu was written, the first specialized work on tea in the world, detailing its preparation, types, and the aesthetics of tea drinking. This transformation of tea into an art required a corresponding myth of origin, one that was worthy, ancient, and connected to a legendary sage. Alongside the Chinese narrative, an Indian version of tea's origin exists, linked to the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma, who, according to legend, cut off his eyelids during meditation to avoid falling asleep, and from the fallen eyelids, tea plants grew. This story is even more obviously mythological, yet it hints at an important connection. Tea and Buddhist meditation went hand in hand, and it was through Buddhist monasteries that the beverage spread to Japan and Korea. The history of tea is a tale of how a practice, emerging at the crossroads of various cultures, gradually transformed over centuries into something so significant that it necessitated a heroic myth of its birth. This is more honest and fascinating than simply the leaves in an emperor's bath. But the leaves in the bath sell better. The next myth is also about origins, and it also illustrates that primacy does not always go to those who arrive first. Myth number 6, the city that became a capital later, or the forgotten first cities of America. New York. This name itself is synonymous with America. 5 boroughs, 8.5 million residents, Wall Street, Broadway, the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, skyscrapers piercing the fog. A global financial center, a cultural capital, a symbol of the American dream. Could it be otherwise? Wasn't New York the main city of the country from the very beginning? No, it wasn't. When the 13 British colonies declared independence in 1776, New York was under British occupation. It was occupied by General Howe's troops and remained in British hands until November 1783, right until the end of the war. While the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia and signing the Declaration of Independence, New York was a city of loyalists and British garrisons. Philadelphia became the first capital of the United States under the Constitution, de facto, as it was there that Congress convened during the Confederation. However, the official first capital designated by the Constitution was New York in 789. While this is closer to the truth, it lasted less than a year and a half. It was here, at Federal Hall on Wall Street, that George Washington took his presidential oath. This is where the country's first Congress operated. New York was indeed the first capital under the Constitution, but it was a very short-lived title. In 1790, the capital moved to Philadelphia and remained there for 10 years while a new, planned federal city was being built. This was a compromise between the North and the South. Northerners wanted Philadelphia, while Southerners wanted something closer to their states. According to legend, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson struck a deal over dinner. The South would support Hamilton's financial plan, and the North would agree to the capital on the Potomac River. Thus, Washington, D.C. was born. Since 1800, it has served as the official capital of the United States, a status it holds to this day. Meanwhile, by the early 19th century, New York surpassed Philadelphia in population and trade volume, and it has remained the largest city in the country ever since. However, being the largest city and being the capital are not the same thing, and they have never coincided in the case of America. The very idea of a deliberately built capital was a conscious political decision. The Founding Fathers did not want financial and political power concentrated in one city. Therefore, New York received the financial resources while Washington received the political power. This division, by the way, continues to this day, leading to endless mutual irritation between the two cities. The notion that New York has always been the main city is a projection of the present onto the past. Although psychologically understandable, it is historically inaccurate. Next, we will explore the story of a man who was also considered Maine, but not for the reasons typically believed. Member 7. A Tyrant in Toga, or Why Caesar Was Really Killed. "Run, Caesar, the Ides of March are dangerous," warns the seer in Shakespeare's play. It's the 15th of March, 44 BC. At the Curia of Pompeii, 23 dagger strikes, the most famous political assassination in history, and the most well-known motive, which is repeated in textbook after textbook. The assassins killed Caesar because he wanted to be king. He was planning to abolish the republic, be crowned, and establish a monarchy. So, the liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, took his life in the name of republican ideals. This version doesn't just oversimplify the story. It flips the political reality of late Republican Rome on its head. Let's begin with the very concept of king. In Rome, the word rex was not just a political term, it was almost a curse, a word that recalled the tyrants of Tarquin, who had been overthrown 5 centuries earlier. The very republic was founded on a rejection of royal power. Rex symbolized everything that Rome stood against. Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone. This is why, according to Plutarch and other sources, he publicly and dramatically refused the royal diadem offered to him by Mark Antony during the Lupercalia festival in February of that same year. Once, twice, 3 times, the crowd ultimately applauded his rejection. It was a carefully orchestrated political performance, a demonstration that Caesar did not desire royal power. So, what did he want? He already had it. By the time of his assassination, Caesar was a lifelong dictator, a position he had legally obtained through a vote by the Senate. The dictator had more real power than any king, complete command of the army, the right to enact laws, and the right to appoint magistrates. In fact, Caesar was already a monarch, just without that hated title. So why kill him now, just days before his departure on a military campaign against Parthia? This is where the real story begins. The conspirators, around 60 members of the Senate, were not assassinating an abstract idea of monarchy. They were eliminating a specific individual who had changed the rules of politics in Rome in a way that threatened their own power and privileges. Caesar systematically dismantled the system that had given the senatorial aristocracy its authority. He granted Roman citizenship to provincial residents. This meant the Senate lost its monopoly on representation. He appointed his own allies to key positions without following the traditional cursus honorum. This meant nobility was no longer the primary criterion for political advancement. He included Gauls and Spaniards in the Senate. This meant that the senatorial class was no longer exclusively Roman. Among the conspirators were many individuals whom Caesar had personally helped. He had pardoned them after the Civil War, appointed them to high offices, and showered them with wealth. This, too, was part of his politics, and it irritated them the most. They depended on his favor. They were not free citizens of the Republic, but clients of the monarch, even if he did not call himself one. Marcus Junius Brutus, the most idealized of the conspirators, the so-called noble Brutus from Shakespeare, was a principled man, but his principles were quite specific. He believed in republican institutions, but by republic he meant a system in which power belonged to the old aristocracy. Caesar's reforms threatened not the freedom of the people, but the privileges of the nobility. The result of the assassination was not the restoration of the republic, but its definitive collapse. 13 years of civil wars, millions dead, and in the end, Octavian Augustus, the first true monarch of Rome, skillfully hiding his power behind republican terminology. The conspirators achieved the exact opposite of what they desired. History is a cruel director. She enjoys such endings. However, the next story is about a different traveler, a different era, and a completely different kind of journey. Myth number 8. Gemter 2012, a Lev story is about Quars. Let's skip to My Way Down. Myth number 8 was pleading ever to visual level to jump the more than longs as click below of them. My Democrat of Karaki, and the Big Tough of Journey. My Joyda as much more. My Joyda as much more. Maybe the jump and build in the news, which things like these adjunces. My myth number 1. My Joyda is much more. My Joyda is much more. My Joyda is much more. My property journey. My funly different. My businesses is a jump-in and magically, and against to speak at the institutional traveler is a different era. My faith number 2. My business is not increased. My mother is make the centum of the journey. My property build is not increased. My myth number 8. My business is about a different traveler as a different era and a completely different filter. My business is not increased. My picture of journey. My business is not increased. My property journey becomes different cribment and to learn with inventions, which is one of the journey was work. My business is not increased. 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 My business get is not increased. My business is not increased. My business get is not increased. My business 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 get is not increased. My business 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 is not increased. My number 8, the first European in China, or what Marco Polo left unsaid. His book was dubbed A Million Lies. The Venetian merchant, who spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan, described China in such detail that his contemporaries believed not a single word. Porcelain? Paper money? Coal that burns underground? Million-strong cities? It sounded like fairy tales. Or lies. Marco Polo, who returned to Venice in the year 1295, was imprisoned in Genoa where, according to legend, he dictated his book to his cellmate, the writer Rustichello. The description of the world, or the Book of Marco Polo, became one of the most read works of medieval Europe. For centuries, it reinforced the notion that the first European to reach China was the Venetian merchant. This is untrue in at least two different ways. Firstly, Marco Polo was not the first. His father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo Polo had already been to China. They were the ones who brought the young Marco on their second journey, but they too were not the first Europeans at the Mongol court. As early as the year 1245, a Franciscan monk named John of Plano Carpini traveled to the Mongols on a mission from Pope Innocent IV, who sought to understand the nature of this fearsome conqueror. He reached Mongolia, attended a Kurultai, witnessed the election of a new great Khan, and wrote a detailed report. In the year 1253, another Franciscan, William of Rubruck, made a similar journey, leaving an even more detailed account. Giovanni da Montecorvino traveled to China as a Catholic missionary in the year 1291, even before Marco Polo returned. He spent the rest of his life there, founding the first Catholic diocese in Beijing. He baptized thousands of Chinese and corresponded with the Pope. Thus, by the time Marco Polo returned to Europe, there was already a documented tradition of European contact with the Mongol Empire, including China. Polo was not the first, he was the most eloquent. But there is a second, much more provocative question. Did he even go there at all? This discussion was raised in modern form by British historian Frances Wood in the year 1995 in her book, Did Marco Polo Go to China? Her arguments are as follows. The description of the world completely lacks references to several things that are impossible to overlook in China: the Great Wall, tea, the hieroglyphic writing system, printing, and the Chinese custom of foot binding among women. For someone who spent 17 years in the country, this is a strange silence. In Chinese sources during the Mongol Khanates, the name Marco Polo is never mentioned, despite the fact that foreigners at the Khan's court were recorded and described. His supposed position as the governor of the province of Yangzhou is not documented anywhere in Chinese records. Supporters of Polo argue that the wall was in ruins during his time and was not considered a significant landmark. He might have known tea by a different name, and Chinese sources do not always account for foreign officials. The debate remains open. However, the very framing of the question reveals much about the nature of historical memory. The description of the world is a literary artifact. Rustichello, the novelist who adapted Polo's tales, clearly added artistic embellishments. Today, it is impossible to distinguish what truly belongs to the merchant and what to his co-author. Marco Polo remains a great symbol, even if his journey was not quite as we imagine it. Symbols are important, but the truth is more important. Now let's address the next myth, about those who traveled nowhere because they were wiped out. At least, that is the prevailing belief. Myth number 9, the vanished empire, or what really happened to the Incas. 1532. Francisco Pizarro and a force of 168 men capture the Inca Emperor Atahualpa. They receive a ransom worth a room filled with gold and silver. He is executed. Cusco is taken. The great empire of Tawantinsuyu, stretching from present-day Ecuador to Chile, fell before a handful of conquistadors. This was one of the most astonishing military events in human history, and gave rise to one of the most enduring myths. The Incas were destroyed. Their culture was shattered, their people exterminated, and their civilization erased by ruthless conquerors. The Incas are alive. There are millions of them. Peruvians, Bolivians, Ecuadorians who speak Quechua are direct descendants of the Incas and the peoples who were part of Tawantinsuyu. Estimates suggest that today, between 8 to 10 million people speak Quechua. It is one of the few pre-Columbian languages in the Americas that holds official status. Quechua is an official language in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The Spanish conquest did not annihilate the population, it transformed it. The demographic catastrophe of the 16th century was real and horrifying. Diseases, primarily smallpox brought by Europeans, wiped out 50 to 90% of the American population in the first 100 years after contact. This is a genuine tragedy, and it cannot be ignored. However, it is not the same as the destruction by the conquistadors. Viruses did not discriminate between Spaniards and Incas. Moreover, the conquest itself was far more complex than a struggle between a handful of heroes and a helpless multitude. Pizarro entered the empire in the midst of a civil war between Atahualpa and his brother Huáscar. Many of the peoples conquered by the Incas in previous decades regarded the Spaniards not as conquerors but as liberators, and actively assisted them. Spanish allies among the local populations numbered in the tens of thousands. 168 Spaniards alone could never have conquered anything. The Andean world after the conquest was neither fully European nor completely destroyed. It became mestizo and synthetic. The Incan aristocracy initially retained its privileged status. The Incan curacas collaborated with the Spanish administration. The Incan history and mythology became subjects of active documentation, primarily by Spanish chroniclers who recognized their value. Cultural conquest was real and profound. It involved the imposition of Christianity, the destruction of the quipu system, and the dismantling of temples which were replaced by churches. However, cultural conquest does not equate to the annihilation of the people. Andean traditions, agriculture, cuisine, weaving, and music persisted, transforming and integrating new elements along the way. Today, in Peru, there is a powerful movement advocating for the rehabilitation of Incan heritage. The Inti Raymi Festival, or the Festival of the Sun, is celebrated annually by thousands. Politicians appeal to Incan identity. Quechua is taught in universities. This is not a memory of a destroyed people. It is a living culture that asserts its place in the modern world. The myth of the destruction of the Incas serves various interests. For the European colonial narrative, it completes and finalizes the conquest. For the anti-colonial narrative, it grants the victims a status of martyrdom. Both versions overlook the descendants of the Incas, who did not disappear and are very much alive and aggrieved by this portrayal. The truth is always more complex than convenient narratives. The next myth pertains to another war, and the belief that it was the last one. Myth number 10. The war to end wars, or how great hopes perish. The war to end war. This phrase is attributed to H.G. Wells, who used it as the title of his book in 1914. Later, it transformed into an official rhetoric of the Allies, becoming a slogan that entered the cultural lexicon. We fight for the last time so that there will never be another war. This is what politicians told their nations. This belief was sincere, at least for a significant portion of those who held it. And this makes the story of its collapse all the more tragic. The very idea that World War I was the last war did not shatter in September 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. It began to crumble immediately, at Versailles in 1919, when the victors crafted a peace that, ironically, sowed the seeds for the next conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was not peace, it was punishment. Germany lost territories, paid unimaginable reparations, lost its army, and signed the Article of War Guilt, a clause that Germans perceived as a humiliation and lacked solid historical backing. Wilson's 14 points, a plan for a just peace, which Germany relied upon when agreeing to an armistice, were essentially tossed aside by the European allies, who sought not justice but compensation. Foch, the supreme commander of Allied forces, inspected the treaty and uttered a prophetic phrase: "This is not peace. This is a truce for 20 years." He was off by just a few months. The Second World War began exactly 20 years and 10 months after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. However, the war to end all wars did not lead to a lasting peace anywhere. While diplomats gathered in Versailles, dozens of armed conflicts were raging around the world. The Russian Civil War, the Greco-Turkish War, the Polish-Soviet War, the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, wars in Ireland, Finland, and Hungary. The end of wars turned into a kaleidoscope of conflicts, some of which were direct consequences of the world's reshaping at Versailles. The phrase itself carried a psychological trap. Labeling any war as the last grants its participants a license for brutality. If this is the last time, then anything is permissible. Everything is justified. This logic allowed governments to demand sacrifices from soldiers and civilians that would never have been accepted if people knew this was not the last war, but just another one. The great hopes of 1918, the League of Nations, self-determination for nations, an end to secret diplomacy, clashed with the reality of human nature, national interests, and economic contradictions. The League existed without the United States, which had proposed it. The Senate refused to ratify it. Self-determination was applied selectively, only where it benefited the victors. Secret diplomacy did not disappear. It merely moved from Berlin to Paris and London. The next myth is also about what the organization actually did, its reputation having become completely detached from the real history. Myth number 11. Inquisition fires, or what were actually burned in the Middle Ages. Inquisition. The mere mention conjures images of dungeons, torture devices, bonfires in public squares, and fanatic monks hunting for any deviation from orthodoxy. In popular consciousness, it is synonymous with terror directed against anything unusual, new, or different, against scholars, philosophers, witches, Jews, and heretics of all kinds. The real Inquisition was a very different institution, not kind, but fundamentally different. Let's begin by noting that Inquisition is not a single organization, but a generic term for several different institutions separated by centuries and operational principles. The medieval Papal Inquisition of the 13th century, the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Portuguese, the Roman, these are distinct structures with varying missions and methods. The first fundamental mistake. The medieval Inquisition was not created to persecute witches. Witchcraft in the 13th and 14th centuries was officially seen as superstition, an error of the common folk. Pope Alexander IV explicitly prohibited inquisitors from investigating witchcraft cases unless they were clearly linked to heresy. The Great Witch Hunt is not a medieval phenomenon, but rather one from the late modern period, spanning from the late 15th to the early 18th centuries. Its peak coincided with the era of the Reformation and religious wars, when the most extensive executions occurred in Protestant states rather than Catholic ones. Secondly, the Inquisition was not established to combat heretics. Its jurisdiction extended solely to baptized Christians. Jews, who were not baptized, were technically outside of its authority. The Spanish Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews and Moors who had converted but were suspected of secretly continuing their previous practices. This was a specific situation related to the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula. Third, and this may be the most surprising aspect, the Inquisition, by its standards of evidence, was in many ways fairer than secular courts of the same era. This might sound provocative, but it has documented justification. Inquisitorial procedures required 2 witnesses or a confession. A confession obtained through torture had to be confirmed without torture. The accused had the right to know the charges against them, and appeals were allowed. By the standards of medieval secular legal proceedings, this was quite a high bar. Torture was indeed used, that cannot be denied. However, it was strictly regulated. Blood could not be shed, physical harm was prohibited, and the duration of torture was limited. Compared to what occurred in secular prisons during the same period, this represented a mitigation rather than an intensification. As for the thousands burned at the stake, the real figures differ drastically from the legend. The Spanish Inquisition, over 3.5 centuries of its existence, sentenced approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people to death, according to modern researchers who have accessed Vatican archives. The actual number executed was significantly lower. Many sentences were carried out symbolically, with an effigy of the convicted person being burned. This does not absolve the Inquisition of blame. However, it was definitely not hundreds of thousands. So, where did this reputation come from? It originated from Protestant and Enlightenment propaganda. The Black Legend of the Spanish Inquisition was actively created by Dutch and English authors, political adversaries of Spain, who found it advantageous to portray it as an empire of religious terror. This legend aligned perfectly with the anti-Catholic sentiments of the time and was disseminated so widely that it became accepted as a known fact. Next, we address the myth surrounding another institution, which also has a much more complex history of origin. Myth number 12, an eternal state, or how the Vatican became independent. The Vatican, a tiny state at the heart of Rome, governed by the Pope, seems as ancient as the Catholic Church itself. Haven't popes always ruled over these hills? Wasn't the Apostle Peter, the first pope, crucified here? Haven't the bones of saints been resting beneath these marble floors since time immemorial? The Vatican City has existed as an independent sovereign state since 1929, less than 100 years. To appreciate how surprising this is, let's take a brief look at the history of papal authority. For most of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, popes ruled a significant part of central Italy, the so-called Papal States, which included Rome, Umbria, Marche, and parts of Emilia-Romagna. It was, in fact, a secular state, complete with an army, taxes, and bureaucracy. The Pope served as both a spiritual leader and a secular monarch. In 1870, the Italian army, led by General Cadorna, entered Rome through Porta Pia, effectively abolishing the Papal States. Rome became the capital of a unified Italy. Pope Pius IX declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, adamantly refusing to recognize the Italian state and locking himself within the walls of the Vatican. His successors maintained this stance for nearly 60 years. This conflict was resolved in February 1929, when Cardinal Pietro Gasparri and Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty. Mussolini needed the Church's support to legitimize his fascist regime. In return, Vatican City gained sovereignty over 44 hectares of territory, compensation for lost lands amounting to 750 million lira, and the official recognition of Catholicism as the state religion of Italy. In exchange, Pope Pius XI acknowledged the Italian state and indirectly supported Mussolini's regime. It was a deal, quite pragmatic, on both sides. Vatican City wasn't born out of ancient traditions, but rather from political calculations back in 1929. Symbolically, the world's smallest sovereign entity, a state covering just a few city blocks, not only exists, but exerts a disproportionately large influence on global politics. That, in itself, is quite remarkable. Why complicate this story with myths of ancient continuity? The next myth also pertains to a work we see every day in reproductions, and about which we know far less than we think we do. Myth number 13. The Last Supper on Plaster, or Why Leonardo Broke All the Rules. In 1495, Leonardo da Vinci took on a commission to adorn the dining hall of the Santa Maria della Grazia monastery in Milan. He would create the Last Supper, one of the most famous images in human history, believed by millions to contain hidden meanings, secret codes, and messages for future generations. Most people refer to the Last Supper as a fresco. Leonardo painted it on canvas, this is one version, or perhaps on wood. Or, of course, it could be a fresco, but it is neither of those things. A fresco is a wall painting technique where pigments are applied to wet plaster. The chemical reaction between lime and pigments creates an exceptionally durable bond. The paint literally becomes part of the wall. This is why Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel have survived for 5 centuries in nearly pristine condition. Leonardo did not use the fresco technique. He applied a layer of resin to dry plaster, followed by white lead, and then tempera and oil on top. Why? Because fresco work requires quick application while the plaster is wet and does not allow for changes later. Leonardo, on the other hand, was an experimental artist who could spend weeks contemplating a canvas without touching it, only to later make a few strokes and disappear again. He desired the control that frescoes do not provide. The price of this choice was paid by the artwork itself. During Leonardo's lifetime, the Last Supper began to deteriorate. Oil and tempera did not adhere to dry plaster as they would in a fresco. A few decades after its completion, the ambassador of the Duke of Milan complained that the painting was in terrible condition. By the 17th century, it had fallen into such disrepair that monks, unsure of how to preserve it, cut a door in the lower part of the wall, destroying the feet of Christ and several apostles. Napoleonic soldiers, using the dining hall as a stable, would throw clumps of dirt at the painting. In the 19th century, it underwent several restorations. Each time, new layers were added over the original. During World War II, the dining hall was bombed, but the painting survived under protective sandbags. By the 20th century, only fragments of the original artwork remained. The restoration from 1978 to 1999, led by Pinin Brambilla Barcelon, was a monumental endeavor. 21 years of meticulous research, removal of later layers, and conservation of the original. Restorers worked under microscopes, removing layer by layer until they reached the very little that Leonardo had left. What emerged beneath centuries of overpainting? The faces of the apostles, which appeared entirely different from what we are used to seeing in reproductions. The color palette was much more delicate and cooler than the dark tones accustomed generations of viewers. The space of the dining hall illusionistically continued the actual space of the monastery refectory, a feature only visible in the original. Leonardo's The Last Supper is both one of the greatest works of art and one of the most damaged by time. Its mystery lies not in hidden messages, but in the fact that the original has barely survived, and we truly do not know how it once looked. The next story is about a character whose existence is highly questionable, but whose legend lives on more confidently than any fresco. Myth number 14. The Noble Robber, or Who Hides Behind the Name of Robin Hood. Sherwood Forest, green clothing, A bow, an arrow flying into the heart of an apple on an innocent's head. Take from the rich, give to the poor. A nobleman from a prestigious family turned into an outcast due to the injustices of Sheriff Nottingham. Robin of Locksley, the Earl of Huntington, companion of Richard the Lionheart, a figure so vivid and concrete that it feels impossible that he never existed. He didn't exist. To be precise, we cannot prove that he existed. No medieval document records a real Robin Hood. No chronicle, no court record, no tax ledger, and medieval bureaucrats kept them with remarkable diligence. Mentions a bandit by that name operating in Sherwood Forest during the period often cited in legends, which is roughly the late 12th to early 13th centuries. The name Robin Hood in medieval England was a common term for vagabonds and petty criminals, much like John Doe in today's American law. Court records include references to Robert Hood or Robin Hood as nicknames for people who were declared outlaws, but these were different individuals in various places and times with no apparent connection to each other. The earliest literary sources about Robin Hood are ballads dated roughly from 1370 to 1450. In the earliest versions, he is not an earl, not a royal companion, nor a champion of justice in the modern sense. He is a commoner, possibly a yeoman, a prosperous farmer, living in the woods. His enemies are not abstract injustice, but very specific targets, abbots charging high interest and sheriffs collecting taxes. The class conflict is present, but it is much more down to earth than the romantic versions of later centuries. The image of the noble outlaw, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, is relatively late. In early ballads, Robin Hood is generous to his companions and guests, but he is not a systematic redistributor of wealth. He hides in the woods, sets up ambushes for merchants and monks, and competes in archery contests. This is literature of dreams, dreams of a life outside the law, of freedom from feudal obligations, of righteous power against unjust authority. The links to specific historical figures, Richard I, Prince John, specific dates and places, came later, when ballad and novel writers sought to add historical credibility to the legend. This is the same process that created Shen Nong as the discoverer of tea, or gave Archimedes a specific bath. Humanity's need for precise coordinates for myth. The absence of a historical prototype does not make Robin Hood any less significant. On the contrary, it frees him. He exists not as a biographical fact, but as a cultural form into which every era pours its own content. In the 20th century, he becomes a socialist. In Hollywood versions, a superhero. In modern interpretations, a feminist or a corporate fighter. Mythological characters endure far longer than historical ones. The following story is about a phenomenon that is widely accepted as a real historical fact. But perhaps this is also a myth. Just a myth created not by romantics, but by state propaganda. Myth number 15. The Villages for the Empress, or The Secret of the Potemkin Myth. 1787. Catherine the Great travels through the recently conquered Crimea, a territory whose annexation became a triumph of her policies. Along the road, prosperous villages flash by. Well-kept homes, content peasants, livestock grazing in the fields. The Empress is pleased. New Russia is thriving. But at night, according to legend, something strange happens. The villages are dismantled, loaded onto wagons and boats, and hurriedly moved forward, so that tomorrow they can stand on the shore again, now as new settlements. Facades without back walls, painted windows, decoy peasants being driven from one place to another. All of this was orchestrated by Prince Potemkin, the favorite and actual co-ruler of Catherine, to hide the desolation of the conquered lands and impress the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, who was also part of the journey. Potemkin villages has become such a well-known expression that it has entered the lexicon in many languages around the world. Ceremonial facades hiding real poverty, a facade, deception by those in power. The problem is, it didn't happen. The journey itself was real. The route was real. Potemkin was indeed responsible for organizing the presentation of the conquered territories. But the version of moving villages is nothing more than propaganda created in real time by Potemkin's diplomatic adversaries and Russia's opponents. The primary source of the legend comes from the diaries and letters of the Saxon diplomat Gelbig and the Austrian Prince Delene, who traveled in Catherine's entourage. Delene and other foreign observers described what seemed artificial and ostentatious in their private correspondence. However, their accounts are based not on direct observations but on hearsay. None of them saw villages being dismantled and relocated. As for the actual state of affairs, historians who examined documents from that period, Potemkin's correspondence, economic reports, and testimonies from local officials, discovered that New Russia was indeed actively developing. From 1774 to 1787, more than 100 new settlements were established, cities were built, roads were constructed, and settlers were attracted. This is real, documented progress. Potemkin did create decorative effects along the route: flags, triumphal arches, and illuminations. This was standard courtly grandeur for a ceremonial visit. But this is fundamentally different from facade villages without back walls. Where did the legend come from? From political rivalry. Potemkin's opponents at the court, envious of his position and influence, were eager to discredit him. Foreign courts, worried about Russia's increasing power in the south, had a vested interest in presenting Russian success in Crimea as illusory. The legend satisfied both needs. Ironically, the name of the most capable statesman of the Catherine era has become synonymous with deception, while his real legacy, New Russia, Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, still stands today. The following story is about another capital that hasn't always been one. Myth number 16. Columbus of Capitals, or the Wanderings of American Authority. Washington, D.C., the White House, the Capitol, the Lincoln Memorial. It's hard to imagine American power anywhere else. Surely, Washington has always been the capital. How could it be otherwise? The answer to that question has already been hinted at in the chapter about New York. However, the history of American capitals is richer and more complicated than just first New York, then Washington. During the years of the War of Independence, the Continental Congress was nomadic. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Lancaster, just one day, the shortest capital in history. York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York. The Congress moved for various reasons: threats from British troops, local discontent, political considerations. The concept of capital during this time was quite fluid. After the adoption of the Constitution in 1789, New York, from April to December 1789, then Philadelphia, from December 1790 to May 1800, and finally Washington, from June 1800. The construction of Washington was slow and painful. When President Adams and Congress moved to the new capital in 1800, the city resembled a construction site in the middle of swamps. The White House was unfinished. Abigail Adams complained about the lack of firewood and had to dry laundry in the grand halls. The streets were unpaved, and most planned buildings were not erected. Officials lived in rented rooms with local farmers. Just 14 years later, the British burned Washington during the War of 1812. Congress fled, the White House was consumed by flames, and some congressmen proposed moving the capital back to Philadelphia or even to another location. The proposal barely failed, and Washington was rebuilt. The history of American capitals is a tale of compromise, practical calculations, and political deals. There was nothing monumentally unavoidable about the current location of the capital. It was a choice made under specific circumstances by specific people. The next myth concerns a different choice, namely, who exactly was included in everyone. Myth number 17, democracy for all, or who actually voted in Athens. 5th century BCE Athens is the cradle of democracy. Every schoolchild knows this. Citizens gather in the agora, everyone can speak up, and every vote counts. For the first time in history, the people govern themselves. And this principle has formed the basis of modern democracies for 25 centuries. This is true, and at the same time, it conceals something fundamental. Every citizen in Athenian democracy was a very specific category. To be eligible to vote, one had to be a man, born free, and the son of an Athenian citizen on both sides. These three strict conditions automatically excluded a vast portion of the population. Women, about half of the free population, did not participate in political life at all. No exceptions, no loopholes. Slaves made up an estimated 20 to 35% of the population of Attica. Some reports suggest that at the height of classical Athens, the number of slaves was roughly equal to that of free people. Slaves were not only deprived of political rights, they were considered property. Metics, free individuals of non-Greek origin living in Athens, constituted a significant part of the city's population. They were traders, craftsmen, philosophers, even Aristotle was a metic, and artists. They paid taxes, served in the military, and contributed to the city's wealth. Yet, they had no political rights. Thus, out of approximately 300,000 residents of Attica, only an estimated 30 to 40,000 people were real participants in Athenian democracy, about 10 to 15% of the population. Does this make Athenian democracy less significant? Not at all. The principle that governance is not in the hands of a single individual or a hereditary elite, but involves a collective of citizens making decisions through discussion and voting was revolutionary. It laid the groundwork for Western political tradition. However, there's a problem. When we idealize Athenian democracy as the rule of the people, we subtly accept its limitations. The logic of "not everyone deserves a say in governance" has persisted in Western political thought for a long time, and it was based precisely on the Athenian precedent. Those in the 19th century who opposed women's suffrage or the abolition of property qualifications often referred back to classical examples. Athenian democracy was a remarkable beginning, but not quite what it is commonly considered to be. The next story is about a grand project that collapsed, not for the reason you might think. Myth number 18. Yellow fever at the Panama Canal, or the truth about the French failure. Panama. The late 19th century. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the victor of Suez, the great Frenchman, the man who carved the canal through Africa, embarks on a new monumental project to connect two oceans through the Panama Isthmus. The idea is genius, the scale unprecedented, and the project collapsed. Nearly 90,000 workers lost their lives. Shareholder money vanished. De Lesseps and his son were convicted of fraud. It became one of the largest financial scandals in the history of the Third French Republic. Why did the French fail? The official answer you'll find in most textbooks: yellow fever and malaria. Tropical diseases killed workers faster than they could be hired. Without a modern understanding of disease carriers, mosquitoes, it was impossible to combat the epidemics. This was a medical failure. The reality is significantly more complex and far less flattering for the French leadership. Yes, the diseases were terrifying. Yes, mortality on the construction site was horrifying. But the medical factor was not the reason for the failure. It was an aggravating circumstance. The root causes lay in engineering, finance, and management, topics that are often discussed far less. De Lesseps insisted on constructing the canal at sea level, without locks, like the Suez Canal. This was an engineering mistake, pointed out to him from the very beginning. The terrain of Panama is incomparably more complicated than that of the Egyptian desert. The mountainous continental divide, unpredictable rivers, and a monstrous volume of rock to be cut through. Later, the Americans built their canal, with locks, just as French engineers had advised de Lesseps. Today, the Panama Canal operates exactly this way. The project's financial model was catastrophic. De Lesseps intentionally understated public cost estimates to attract investors. The actual expenses exceeded projections several times, and he knew it. When the initial stock offerings did not raise enough money, the company issued new shares, paying off debts with new loans. This was a classic scheme that could only survive if the project was completed on time, and it was chronically delayed. Corruption was systemic. A significant portion of the funds went to bribes for French parliamentarians and journalists who were supposed to protect the company's reputation and hinder investigations. When the scandal finally erupted, it became one of the largest in French political history. Hundreds of officials, deputies, and senators were implicated in receiving money from the Panama Company. Yellow fever was a real disaster for people dying in tropical shacks, but for the company's financial collapse, it was merely a convenient explanation to conceal the incompetence of the leadership and the scale of corruption. The next myth is about a military victory, the explanation of which has also become a legend. Myth number 19. The Archers of Agincourt, or Why the Victory Was Not Where It Sought. Henry V, by Shakespeare, a speech before battle. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Agincourt, October 25, 1415. 6,000 exhausted, sick, rain-soaked English soldiers against 25 to 30,000 of the French chivalry. And an astonishing victory. How is this possible? The answer given in textbooks, films, and popular literature: English longbows. Welsh and English archers capable of firing 10 to 12 arrows per minute literally bombarded the French knights with a hail of iron. The arrows pierced the visors, found gaps in the armor, and killed horses. The French were defeated before they even reached the English positions. This is partly true, but this partial truth hides something significant. Longbows were indeed a formidable weapon, and English archers inflicted heavy damage on the French cavalry. However, the effectiveness of the longbow can largely be attributed not just to the skill of the archers, but also to the tactical situation. The French knights launched their attack on a narrow field flanked by forests on both sides. The heavy cavalry lost its maneuverability, the ground was wet and slippery from recent rains, horses stumbled, and knights in heavy armor fell and couldn't get back up. English archers were positioned behind rows of sharpened stakes driven into the ground, a simple yet effective anti-cavalry barrier. But the decisive factor for victory at Agincourt is rarely discussed in popular accounts. After the first French assault, where the main losses had already been inflicted, Henry encountered an unexpected problem: thousands of prisoners captured during the battle. The prisoners were cramped, disoriented, but not disarmed. Suddenly, a group of French peasants attacked the supply wagons behind the English lines. Fearing that the prisoners might launch an attack on the guards while all forces were engaged with this new threat, Henry ordered that most of the captives be killed. This was a mass execution of individuals who had already laid down their arms, a gross violation of the chivalric codes of the time. Chroniclers write about this with horror, and Shakespeare hints at it while carefully avoiding condemnation of his hero. The victory at Agincourt was real and impressive. However, it was achieved through a combination of shrewd tactics, favorable terrain, weather conditions, and actions that were deemed dishonorable by contemporaries. The myth of a pure triumph of heroic skill over numbers is a legend created by later propaganda. The next myth takes us across the Atlantic, to the people whose dwellings became symbols of a whole way of life. Myth number 20. All Indians lived in teepees, or How Hollywood Created America. A conical tent made of hides, adorned with geometric patterns, feathers in hair, a horse, a tomahawk. This image, the deeply ingrained Indian in popular consciousness, actually represents a very specific group of tribes, the peoples of the Great Plains, who emerged as a cultural phenomenon in the 18th and 19th centuries. The teepee is a remarkable structure, perfectly suited to the nomadic life of buffalo hunters. It can be quickly assembled and disassembled, provides warmth in winter, allows ventilation in summer, and stands firm against prairie winds. However, teepees were homes for only some of the peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet, and only them. Native peoples of North America before European contact consisted of several hundred distinct cultural groups, each with different languages, economic systems, and architectural traditions. The Iroquois built longhouses made of wood and bark, homes for several families living together. The Navajo lived in hogans, round earthen dwellings. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest built large wooden houses adorned with carved totems. The Pueblo constructed multi-story stone fortress homes that amazed Spanish conquistadors with their resemblance to cities in Spain. The Seminoles of Florida lived in open platform houses designed for the humid climate, while the Inuits resided in igloos made of snow and semi-subterranean homes. The term Indians is a result of Christopher Columbus's geographical blunder, which grouped hundreds of distinct nations under one name, similar to how one might refer to all Eurasian residents as Eurasians and depict them all in Russian fur hats. How did the teepee become the universal Indian dwelling? Through Hollywood westerns. The Plains tribes, especially the Lakota Sioux, emerged as the main protagonists in the Indian Wars of the late 19th century. Their clashes with the U.S. Army occurred in front of numerous witnesses, were extensively covered by the press, and were captured in photographs. The Wild West became a Central American myth, and the peoples who inhabited it became a visual symbol of what it meant to be an Indian. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, touring the U.S. and Europe since 1883, featured Lakota warriors and teepees as the main attraction. Millions of viewers across the globe saw this image, and it became canonical. The diversity of real North America is one of the greatest sacrifices made at the altar of narrative. Now, let's explore the next myth, about a date widely considered to be absolute and definitive, but which is not. Myth number 21, May 8th, or when the war really ended. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. London, New York, and Paris explode with joy. The war in Europe is over. This statement is as accurate as saying, winter ended on March 1st. Germany's official surrender was signed twice. First, on the night of May 7th to 8th in Reims, a preliminary act signed with the Western Allies, and second, on May 9th in Berlin, a formal ceremony for the Soviet side, which insisted on a legally binding act in the presence of representatives from all Allied nations. This is why the Soviet Union and most Eastern European countries celebrate Victory Day on May 9th, while Western countries do so on May 8th. However, even this date did not mark the end of hostilities. At the time of the surrender signing, German forces were still fighting in several locations, not just due to a lack of information. Some German units surrendered to Western allies while refusing to capitulate to Soviet troops. On Bornholm Island, the German garrison surrendered to Soviet forces on May 9th, but only after a Soviet bombing. German troops on the Atlantic Wall, isolated fortresses along the coast of France, continued to surrender over the days following the official capitulation. The Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Schorner, continued fighting in Czechoslovakia for several days after May 8th. It was against this group that the last major offensive operation of the Soviet forces in Europe, the Prague Offensive, was directed, concluding on May 11th. At sea, the situation was even more complicated. German submarines in the Atlantic received radio signals about the surrender, but each commander had to make their own choice, to surface and surrender or to sink to avoid capture. Several submarines headed towards the shores of Argentina for weeks after May 8th, where their commanders hoped to find refuge. One extreme case involved Japanese troops on some Pacific islands who continued to fight for years, either because they did not receive information about the surrender or simply did not believe it. The last of these soldiers, Hiro Onoda in the Philippines, laid down his arms only in 1974, 29 years after the war ended. War does not conclude with the signing of a document. It is a gradual winding down that can take weeks or even decades. Next is a myth about an event that is commonly thought to be well documented, but may have occurred quite differently. Myth number 22, the Reformer's Mallet, or how Luther did not nail his theses. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther approaches the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, takes out a mallet, and ceremoniously nails a sheet containing 95 theses against indulgences to the wood. The sound of the hammer echoes throughout Europe. The Reformation begins. This image has become an icon of Protestantism, a solitary monk challenging the might of the Roman Church with a symbolic act, the hammer and nail as instruments of revolution. However, Luther almost certainly did not nail his theses to the church door, at least not in the dramatic form that has entered legend. The main issue with this narrative is that it appears in sources significantly later than the event itself. The only source claiming that Luther nailed the theses is a biography written by his friend and ally Philip Melanchthon years after Luther's death. Melanchthon was not in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. Luther himself does not describe this event in his numerous letters and writings as a formal public act. His own contemporary descriptions of the situation are much more mundane. He sent the theses to several bishops and theologians, proposing an academic discussion. This was standard university practice, posting theses for debate. The door of the church at the university in Wittenberg was indeed used as a bulletin board. It's possible that some clerk or Luther himself did attach the theses to the door as an announcement for an upcoming discussion. But the idea of nailing them ceremoniously with a hammer is a reconstruction by later hagiographers. What happened next was far more interesting than the hammer. Luther's theses were written in Latin for an academic audience. They were translated into German and, using Gutenberg's new invention, the printing press, spread throughout Germany in just a few weeks. This was the first viral publication in history, to use modern terminology. The theses found their readers not because Luther nailed them to a door with a hammer, but because the technology for disseminating information had suddenly changed beyond recognition. The Reformation was possible not because of the hammer. It was made possible by the printing press. The next myth concerns another organization, which is often viewed as much older and more noble in origin. Myth number 23, the Samurai Brotherhood, or what Yakuza really is. Yakuza, tattooed warriors of the shadowy world of Japan, a code of honor, finger-cutting as an expression of remorse, loyalty to the clan. In the collective consciousness, and to a large extent in Japanese public discourse, the Yakuza is positioned as a continuation of the samurai tradition, an organization with roots in feudal Japan, living by a code similar to Bushido. However, the true origins of the Yakuza are far less romantic. The name Yakuza comes from a combination of cards in the Japanese game Oicho Kabu, 893. In Japanese, Ya means 8, Ku means 9, and Za means 3. This combination is the worst hand in the game, equal to 0 points. Yakuza implied a loser, a worthless person. The organization ironically named itself the outcasts of society, a bitter twist or a challenge. The real historical roots of the Yakuza trace back to two groups from the Edo period, the 17th to 19th centuries. Tekiya, itinerant merchants who sold goods at fairs and markets, often engaging in fraud, and Bakuto, professional gamblers. Neither of these groups had any connection to the samurai class. They hailed from the very lowest echelons of the social hierarchy in Tokugawa Japan, classes not even included in the official four-tiered system. The samurai aesthetic was deliberately borrowed later as a tool for self-legitimacy. Principles of loyalty, hierarchy, and codes of conduct were all copied from samurai culture and imposed on criminal organizations seeking to present themselves as something greater than mere gangs of racketeers. This is marketing, not history. Modern Yakuza, as an organized structure, largely formed during the post-war period, especially amid the chaos of the black market and the devastation after 1945. It thrived precisely when traditional state structures were weakened and the country's economy required informal mechanisms. There is no continuous tradition from feudal times. Interestingly, Yakuza organizations have actively cultivated and continue to cultivate their samurai image. It's beneficial for recruitment, maintaining discipline, and negotiating with official authorities. Japanese society long tolerated the existence of the Yakuza because they accepted the narrative of organized crime as a guardian of traditional values. The next myth is about a speech that broke down the wall, both literally and figuratively. Myth number 24, tear down this wall, or who really broke the USSR? On June 12, 1987, President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," he declared. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union disintegrated. The Cold War came to an end. In the American collective consciousness and in much of American political rhetoric, this cause and effect relationship is considered obvious. Reagan defeated the USSR through the power of his personality, his speech, and his policies. However, the reality was much more complex, and far less flattering to the idea that one person or one country brought down the Soviet system. Let's begin with the speech itself. It had no immediate effect. The Soviet press virtually ignored it. There were no immediate political changes. The West German media took note of it casually. The speech was recorded and then forgotten, at least for the moment. The Berlin Wall didn't fall due to Reagan's speech. It fell on November 9, 1989, as a result of a series of absurd bureaucratic events. The new leader of East Germany announced a press conference. He was asked about new rules for travel abroad. Reading from a paper handed to him, not fully understanding its content, he declared that East German citizens could cross the border freely. When? Immediately, without delay. Crowds gathered at the border crossings. The guards were not given instructions. A senior officer made the decision to open the gates. That was it. The wall fell. This was not a planned operation. It was a mistake compounded by bureaucratic chaos. As for the collapse of the USSR, this was a process rooted in the structural contradictions of the Soviet system that had been building for decades. An economy unable to compete with the West in technological advancement, national movements in the Union republics, the Afghan War, which became for the USSR what Vietnam was for the USA. The oil shock of the 80s, which devastated the primary source of Soviet income, increasing corruption and a loss of ideological legitimacy. Reagan's policies, an arms race, support for anti-Soviet movements, the Strategic Defense Initiative, did create additional pressure, but attributing primary responsibility to them means ignoring the internal contradictions that Soviet citizens and their leaders felt daily. Gorbachev, who made the decision not to use military force to suppress popular movements in Eastern Europe, did more for a peaceful end to the Cold War than any American speech ever could. This decision, not to send troops into Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, contradicted the entire logic of the Soviet system, and it cost him his power. History rarely changes because of a single speech, but one good speech at the right moment can serve as a beautiful epilogue to a complex process. The next myth revolves around a scientific discovery that is often attributed to a single individual. Myth number 25. Waves in space-time. Or, who really predicted gravitational waves? September 2015. The LIGO detectors detect the first credible signal of gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time caused by the merger of two black holes. This is one of the greatest discoveries in the history of physics. And immediately comes the response. Einstein was right, because it was Einstein who predicted the existence of gravitational waves in 1916 as part of his general theory of relativity. This is true, and yet it tells only part of the story. First, Einstein himself doubted the reality of gravitational waves. In 1936, he, along with Nathan Rosen, wrote a paper arguing that gravitational waves do not exist. They are a mathematical artifact rather than a physical reality. The journal Physical Review rejected the paper with critical feedback from reviewers. Einstein was outraged. The journal later published a revised version with the opposite conclusion, after Einstein had considered the reviewers' arguments. So, Einstein first predicted gravitational waves, then abandoned that prediction, and later returned to it. This is normal science, but it doesn't fit the linear narrative of the genius predicted, we confirmed, that is typically conveyed. Secondly, a tremendous contribution to the very existence of LIGO, the detector that discovered gravitational waves, was made by individuals whose names are nearly unknown to the general public. Rainer Weiss, Kip Thorne, and Barry Barish received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017, rightfully so. However, LIGO was built and launched through the efforts of thousands of scientists and engineers over 40 years. The technology of laser interferometry that enabled the detection of vibrations smaller than a proton involves decades of engineering work unrelated to Einstein's name. Thirdly, Henri Poincaré used a concept very similar to gravitational waves as early as 1905, a year before Einstein's special theory of relativity and 11 years before work on gravitational waves. The history of science is far more collective than the narrative of lone geniuses suggests. Next, we will explore a story about a tragedy that took a century for official recognition. Myth number 26, and recognized genocide, or how the world turned a blind eye. The Armenian genocide was recognized by the international community. This statement can be heard in a variety of contexts, as if it were a given, as if international recognition had occurred long ago, unanimously, and stands as a completed fact. In reality, this is one of the most painful and unresolved issues in the realm of international historical politics. The Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923 claimed, by various estimates, between 600,000 to 1.5 million lives. This systematic extermination of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire, including deportations to the Syrian desert, mass shootings, and forced death marches, is extensively documented through diplomatic reports, accounts from American, German, allies of Turkey, and neutral sources, photographs, and testimonies from survivors. Turkey officially does not acknowledge the genocide, referring to the events of 1915 as tragic events or mutual losses in a time of war. This official state position has remained unchanged since the founding of the Republic of Turkey. When did the major powers officially recognize the genocide? The United States formally recognized it only in April of 2021 under President Biden. Prior to that, American presidents avoided using the term due to strategic partnership considerations with Turkey, a NATO member. Biden's predecessors from both parties, including those who promised recognition during election campaigns, consistently backed down after taking office. Germany recognized the genocide in 2016, 100 years after the events, in which its own diplomats and military personnel were witnesses and sometimes participants. This recognition was also not unanimous. The resolution sparked intense debates, and Turkey recalled its ambassador. To date, approximately 30 countries have recognized the genocide. This is a significant portion of the global community, but far from all. Neither the UN as a whole, nor most countries in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East have given official recognition. This remains a living, unresolved issue, not a historically concluded fact. Geopolitics of memory. That's how historians refer to it. Recognition or denial of historical crimes is influenced not only by historical evidence, but also by current alliances, economic interests, and strategic calculations. Next, we delve into a myth regarding another event of the 20th century, which is often presented differently than it actually occurred. Myth number 27, without warning, or what did Japan know before Hiroshima? August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Enola Gay. The 45, Hiroshima, Enola Gay. The first combat atomic bomb in history. 140,000 people would perish by the end of the year. This was a sudden strike, and Japan had no warning. This is not quite accurate. Just days before the bombing of Hiroshima, American planes dropped leaflets over Japanese cities, warning of impending destruction. The leaflets were vague. They did not mention the new weapon or specify particular cities. Specific targets were kept secret for military reasons, but they urged the Japanese to evacuate from military-industrial cities. About 35 Japanese cities received warnings of impending air attacks just days before the actual strikes, a standard practice during American strategic bombing campaigns. Specifically, leading up to the bombing of Hiroshima. On July 13, 1945, President Truman was informed that the Trinity test had been successful. On July 26, the Allies released the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum to Japan demanding unconditional surrender under the threat of prompt and utter destruction. The declaration did not explicitly mention the atomic bomb, for several reasons, including the fact that the United States was not yet certain of its combat readiness. The Japanese government rejected the ultimatum. This decision appeared to be made amid sharp divisions within the Japanese government and military. Part of the leadership recognized that the war was lost, while another part believed continuation was possible. As for the decision to drop the bombs, the debate over its moral justification continues to this day. Were all alternatives explored? Was a demonstration over uninhabited territory feasible? Did the USSR's entry into the war hasten Japan's surrender? These questions have no definitive answers, but the fact remains, the bombing of Hiroshima was not without warning in the absolute sense commonly depicted. It was without specific warning about specific weapons in a specific city. That's a different level. The next story is about people who lived outside the law, yet created surprisingly complex legal systems. Myth number 28. Democracy on a pirate ship, or the truth and romanticism of maritime banditry. Pirates of the Caribbean, the Jolly Roger on the mast, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Bartholomew Roberts. In popular culture, especially after historian Marcus Rediker described pirates as a sort of maritime anarchists in his book Villains of All Nations, an image of the pirate ship as a utopia of equality has emerged. Democratic elections for captain, fair distribution of loot, social insurance for the injured, and voting rights for all. This is not a myth. It's a half-truth with significant omissions. Pirate articles, codes of conduct aboard ships, did exist and were remarkably democratic for their time. Many of them have been preserved in court records of those who were captured and tried. The captain was elected by crew vote and could also be removed by them. Shares of the loot were allocated according to pre-agreed rules. Compensation for injuries was provided, a kind of insurance. These are real facts. However, there was another aspect that the romanticized version often overlooks. Democracy on a pirate ship only extended to those who were there voluntarily. A significant portion of the crews were captured from seized vessels and recruited under duress. Such individuals formally signed the articles, but their consent was coerced. Historians debate the actual proportion of volunteers and coerced individuals on various ships. Captive prisoners who refused to join were systematically tortured or killed. If democracy existed on board, it was only for the chosen few. For everyone else, it was terror. Moreover, the very concept of democracy had strict limits. The quartermaster, the second in command on the ship, held significant power that constrained the captain's authority. However, in battle, the captain wielded absolute power. Articles detailed discipline and punishments. There was no room for anarchy. Pirates of the Golden Age, around 1730, operated within a specific historical context. Many of them were former privateers or naval sailors who found themselves unemployed after the wars of the Spanish Succession. Their democratic practices were partly a response to the brutality of the official navy, where captains had unchecked power, salaries were delayed, and punishments were harsh. The romanticization of piracy is understandable, and somewhat justified. But it shouldn't obscure the fact that pirates were primarily criminals who killed and plundered. Next myth, about the man who discovered a new world unknowingly. Myth number 29, the stubborn discoverer, or what Columbus really thought. Columbus, until the end of his life, was convinced he discovered India. This statement comes off as a condescending anecdote about the stubbornness of one man. The great navigator, unable to accept the obvious, an obstinate old man insisting on India while the whole world already knew the truth. The reality was far more complex. Firstly, Columbus did insist until his death that he had reached Asia, but this was not sheer madness. It was a conscious stance based on his theoretical calculations and theological beliefs. He believed he had arrived at the eastern islands of Asia, the Spice Islands, part of the large Asian archipelago. This interpretation explained much of what he observed. Secondly, the very concept of the New World did not emerge immediately. The first to articulate in writing that the lands to the west were not Asia but a separate continent was Amerigo Vespucci in his letters from the early 16th century. His name gave that continent its title. However, this occurred after several expeditions. Thirdly, and most importantly, Columbus was aware of real distances. He understood that Greek geographers had calculated the circumference of the Earth fairly accurately. To align his calculations, he intentionally underestimated the distance to Asia, using Arabic miles instead of Italian ones where it benefited him. He wanted to reach Asia within a reasonable distance. When his ships landed exactly where he expected to find the Asian islands, it seemed to validate his calculations rather than refute them. The most bitter part of this story is that Columbus apparently died disappointed and in disgrace, not receiving the privileges due to him by contract from the Spanish crown. Its discovery was immediately reinterpreted by others, its routes were enhanced, and its management of overseas territories was deemed catastrophic. Rightly so. The man who changed the world was not recognized during his lifetime, even by those who benefited the most from his efforts. History can be a harsh accountant. It attributes achievements to the victors, not the pioneers. The last myth is about a disease that is often thought to be a thing of the past. Myth number 30, the end of the plague, or a disease that never really left. The Black Death, 1347 to 1353, a third of Europe. Corpses in the streets. Gravediggers unable to keep up. Pictures of hell invading the real world. Then came a gradual fade, subsequent waves that were smaller, even smaller, and finally, by the 18th and 19th centuries, a near total disappearance of the disease from Europe. Did the plague disappear? The plague never disappeared. Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes the plague, exists in rodent populations around the globe, in the American prairies, in Central Asia, in Africa, in China. It never left. It merely stopped killing people on a massive scale, for reasons that historians and epidemiologists are still trying to fully understand. The plague continued to kill people even after the 14th century, just on a smaller scale. Epidemics in London during the 17th century claimed thousands of lives. The Great Plague in Marseille from 1720 to 1722 killed about 50,000 people, half the city's population. The third pandemic of plague, which began in China in 1855, spread worldwide and took over 12 million lives, mainly in India. This was the 20th century. This is not the Middle Ages. According to the World Health Organization, between 1,000 to 2,000 cases of plague are reported each year globally. The most common hotspots include Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Peru, and Bolivia. An outbreak in Madagascar in 2017 was declared an emergency by WHO. More than 2,000 cases, over 200 deaths. Cases of plague are reported in the United States, an average of a few cases each year, primarily in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. The sources are squirrels, prairie dogs, and other wild rodents. The last fatality in the U.S. occurred relatively recently. Why did the plague stop killing millions in Europe? There is no definitive answer. Some theories suggest improved sanitation, a change in the balance of black and brown rats, with brown rats being less inclined to live closely with humans, or perhaps even the evolution of immunity in a portion of the population that survived multiple outbreaks. Antibiotics, discovered in the 20th century, allow for effective treatment of the plague when detected early. But the bacteria itself did not go anywhere. The image of the plague as a medieval disease is deeply ingrained and very much mistaken. It creates a false sense of security. The history of diseases knows no final victors, it only knows temporary truces. And now we have reached the last page of this archive, 30 myths. 30 times history is proven to be more complex, fascinating, and honest than we usually think. What ties all these stories together? Myths arise from needs. The need for a hero, for simple explanations, for beautiful symbols, for convenient enemies, for legitimizing narratives. These needs are very human and understandable. The problem arises when we can no longer distinguish myth from fact, when we start making decisions based on appealing stories rather than real events. History is not a collection of ready-made answers. It is a living conversation that each generation engages in anew. And this conversation requires a willingness to hear the uncomfortable, to accept the complex, and to let go of what was once common knowledge. Archives continue to hold their secrets. Researchers keep asking difficult questions, and myths persist because we continue to nurture them. The question is not whether new myths will emerge, they certainly will. The question is how quickly we will learn to recognize them. Until the next archival discovery.